Welcome to Module 5. Up to this point in the Decoder experience, we've talked about confusion cycles, emotional instability, manipulation dynamics, trauma bonds, and emotional dependency. Now, in this module, we're going to shift the focus towards something many survivors struggle to recognize clearly after emotionally unhealthy relationships. What healthy love actually feels like. Because one of the biggest consequences of emotionally destabilizing relationships is that many people slowly lose their emotional reference point for safety. Over time, chaos can start feeling normal. Inconsistency can start feeling familiar. Emotional intensity can start feeling romantic. And calmness can actually start feeling uncomfortable. It's kind of important because many survivors do not realize how much emotional instability changed their nervous system until they finally experience emotional safety again. Now, let me say something carefully here. Healthy relationships are not perfect. Healthy people still make mistakes. Healthy couples still disagree. Healthy relationships still experience stress, frustration, and emotional difficulty sometimes. But emotionally healthy relationships do not consistently create emotional confusion, emotional fear, chronic instability, or emotional survival mode. That matters. That matters greatly because now one of the first signs of emotional safety is this. You feel emotionally safe being honest. You do not constantly fear emotional punishment for expressing disappointment, discomfort, boundaries, or emotional needs. That's super important because many survivors become so accustomed to emotional instability that they begin shrinking themselves emotionally to avoid triggering conflict. They rehearse conversations mentally. They monitor tone constantly. They over-explain simple emotions. They suppress concerns to keep the relationship emotionally stable. And eventually, emotional honesty starts feeling dangerous. Healthy relationships should not require chronic self-silencing. Now, let's talk about emotional intensity. Many emotionally unhealthy relationships feel intense. The chemistry feels intense. The attachment feels intense. The emotional highs feel intense. The emotional lows feel intense. The longing feels intense. The conflict feels intense. And many people mistake emotional intensity for emotional depth. But intensity and safety are not the same thing. In fact, emotionally unstable relationships often feel more emotionally consuming precisely because they create instability. The nervous system becomes hyperactivated. One moment hope, the next moment fear. One moment closeness, the next moment withdrawal. That emotional unpredictability creates intensity. But intensity is not automatically intimacy. And emotional chaos is not automatically connection. Healthy love often feels calmer than trauma bonds, safer than trauma bonds, more stable than trauma bonds. And I'm going to tell you, for many survivors, that calmness initially feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because their nervous system became conditioned to be emotionally unpredictable. Now, another important part of emotional safety is accountability. Healthy communication allows room for accountability without emotional destruction. Healthy people can acknowledge emotional impact without turning every conversation into defensiveness, blame shifting, or emotional warfare. That doesn't mean healthy people are perfect communicators, but emotionally healthy relationships allow people to express concerns without constantly leaving conversations emotionally destabilized. Now, let's talk about consistency. Consistency is one of the clearest indicators of emotional safety, not perfection. Consistency, consistent respect, consistent communication, consistent emotional availability, consistent accountability, consistent care. Many survivors become emotionally attached to isolated emotional highs because consistency was missing for so long. But healthy love is not built on emotional unpredictability. It's built on emotional reliability. That right there is very important. Now, another thing emotionally healthy relationships allow is individuality. You do not lose yourself emotionally in order to maintain connection. You are still allowed your boundaries, your emotions, your identity, your friendships, your needs, your voice. Emotionally unhealthy relationships often slowly erode individuality through emotional pressure, instability, guilt, or dependency. Healthy relationships support emotional autonomy, not emotional captivity. That really matters. Now, let's talk about conflict. Healthy conflict still feels uncomfortable sometimes, but healthy conflict usually moves towards understanding, repair, clarification, and resolution. Not chronic confusion, not emotional punishment, not humiliation, not repeated emotional destabilization. Healthy disagreements do not consistently leave people feeling crazy, worthless, emotionally unsafe, or disconnected from themselves. Now that is a major difference. Now, here's something many survivors struggle to accept emotionally. Sometimes emotionally healthy relationships feel less exciting at first. Not because they lack depth, but because the nervous system is no longer trapped inside constant emotional highs and crashes. There is less emotional chaos, less fear, less unpredictability, less emotional survival. And for people conditioned to trauma bonds, stability can initially feel emotionally unfamiliar. That's why healing often includes relearning what emotional safety actually feels like. Now, let's talk about boundaries. Healthy relationships respect boundaries, not perfectly every single time, but consistently. Emotionally healthy people do not view boundaries as attacks. They may feel disappointed sometimes. They may need communication or clarification, but healthy relationships do not consistently respond to boundaries with punishment, rage, withdrawal, mockery, or emotional intimidation. Again, that matters. That matters hugely because boundaries often reveal the emotional health of a relationship. Now, another important sign of emotional safety is this: you feel more like yourself over time, not less. You feel more emotionally grounded. Now, the thing is, you don't feel more emotionally unstable. You feel more emotionally connected to yourself, not more disconnected, more emotionally secure, not more chronically anxious. Again, that's very important because let me tell you, emotionally unhealthy relationships often slowly disconnect people from themselves, while emotionally healthy relationships help people feel more emotionally stable within themselves. Now, once again, let me say something clearly. Emotionally healthy love is not boring, it's peaceful. And many survivors confuse peace with lack of passion because emotional chaos becomes tied to emotional attachment for way too long. But you know, when you think about it, peace is not emptiness. Peace is emotional safety. Peace is consistency. Peace is honesty. Peace is actually knowing you can communicate without constantly fearing emotional punishment. Peace is emotional grounding. And you know what? Peace matters. Now, before we close this module, I want you to reflect honestly on something. When you imagine love, do you imagine calmness, safety, stability, consistency, and emotional grounding? Or do you imagine emotional intensity, obsession, fear of loss, emotional unpredictability, and constant emotional highs and crashes? That reflection matters because healing often requires separating emotional addiction from emotional safety. And once people begin experiencing emotional safety consistently, they often realize how exhausting emotional survival mode truly was. Now, in the next module, we're going to talk about one of the hardest but most powerful parts of healing: radical acceptance. Let me say that again. Radical acceptance. Letting go of emotional denial, stopping the habit of rewriting reality, and rebuilding self-trust through emotional honesty and grounded observation. Let's continue decoding these patterns together.